The air at the Miller County Equipment Auction hung thick and heavy, a humid August cocktail of diesel fumes, cheap cigars, and the sweet, dusty smell of alfalfa from the fields bordering the lot. It was 1973, and you could feel a charge in that air, a nervous energy that smelled like money. Corn was pushing $3 a bushel. The Russians were buying every grain they could get their hands on, and farmers who'd spent a decade just getting by were suddenly talking about expansion. Hank Miller stood near the back, his arms crossed over his chest, his shadow long in the late afternoon sun. He wasn't here for the big, shiny, new stuff. His eyes were fixed on a piece of history parked between a rusty New Holland baler and a set of worn-out disc harrows. It was a 1951 Farmall M. Its red paint faded to a dull, sun-baked orange, but the sheet metal was straight, the tires held air, and the engine block showed no signs of cracks or clumsy welds. It was an honest machine. A heavy slap on his back nearly knocked the breath out of him. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. You gonna buy yourself a real tractor today, Hank, or just kick the tires on the antiques?" Hank turned. It was Chet Larson, flanked by two of his buddies and Stan Gable, the owner of the local John Deere dealership. Chet was 10 years younger than Hank, with a cocky grin that never seemed to leave his face, and a wallet that had gotten fat almost overnight. He'd been one of the first in the county to buy a new John Deere 4430 with the sound guard cab, and he never missed a chance to talk about its air conditioning or its 8-track tape player. Hank just nodded. Chet, Stan. Stan Gable, a man whose green polo shirt was a shade lighter than the tractors he sold, smirked. "Heard you were looking for another tractor, Hank. I can get you a great deal on a 4020 trade-in. Power steering, synchro range transmission. Time to join the 20th century, old son." "Appreciate the offer, Stan, but I've got my eye on something else," Hank said, his gaze returning to the Farmall. Chet followed his look and let out a loud, braying laugh. "You're kidding me? That old relic? What are you going to do with that? Put it in a parade? You already got one of those old things." "My H is a good tractor," Hank said, his voice low and even. "But I could use a little more horsepower for the big plow. An M will do just fine." "An M? Hank, that thing's barely 50 horsepower on a good day, going downhill with a tailwind. My 40-430 would pull that thing in half and not even spill my coffee," Chet boasted, elbowing one of his friends. "Why would you buy another piece of junk when you could have a real machine?" Hank didn't answer. He'd learned long ago that arguing with a man like Chet was like trying to teach a pig to sing. It wasted your time and annoyed the pig. His father had taught him something else, too. He'd farmed through the Depression, and the words were etched into Hank's soul. "Debt is a chain you forge yourself, link by link. The bankman's smile is wider when the crop is short." Hank owned his 240 acres free and clear, his Farmall H, his old International truck, his John Deere 6600 combine. They were all his. Not his and the bank's. Every nut, every bolt, every grease fitting. That peace of mind was worth more than all the air-conditioned cabs in the world. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a sweat-stained straw hat, finally got to the Farmall. "All right, boys, here she is. A classic international harvester. Farmall M. Starts right up. Runs like a top. Solid iron right here, fellas. Who'll give me $500 to start it off? 500. 5. Who'll give me 5? A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. 500 was a fair starting price. 500! Hank called out, his voice clear and steady. Got 500 from Hank Miller. Who'll give me 600? Chet Larson let out another loud chuckle. "Go on, Hank. Buy your toy," he shouted, loud enough for half the county to hear. Stan Gable shook his head, a look of pitying condescension on his face. 600, another farmer from the north end of the county called. 650, Hank countered immediately. 700. 750, Hank said, without blinking. His eyes were locked on the auctioneer, ignoring the snickers from Chet's direction. He had walked every inch of that tractor. He'd seen the clean oil on the dipstick, noted the lack of excessive blow-by from the crankcase breather tube, and felt the clutch engage smoothly. He knew what it was worth. He knew what it was worth to him. The bidding stalled at $900. The other farmer shook his head and backed away. 900 once, 900 twice, the auctioneer chanted, his eyes scanning the crowd. Sold, for $900 to Hank Miller. A smattering of polite applause was drowned out by another guffaw from Chet. As Hank walked up to the clerk's trailer to settle his bill in cash, Stan Gable caught his arm. "Hank, I'm serious," the dealer said, lowering his voice. "You're a good farmer, but you can't compete with iron like that. The interest rates are low. I can get you into a new 4230, 0 down for a man with your credit. You're leaving money on the table trying to patch together a fleet of museum pieces." "I appreciate it, Stan, but I prefer to sleep at night," Hank said simply, pulling his arm away. He paid the clerk, got the bill of sale, and walked back to the old Farmall. It was his now. He climbed up onto the steel pan seat, feeling the familiar, solid heft of the machine. He checked the fuel, pulled the choke, and hit the starter. The big 4-cylinder engine turned over twice, then barked to life with a puff of blue smoke and settled into a deep, rhythmic, reassuring idle. Pop, 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 pop. It was the sound of simple, reliable power, the sound of independence. He drove it off the auction lot, past Chet Larson's shiny Ford pickup and Stan Gable's dealership sedan. They watched him go, shaking their heads and laughing. Hank didn't look back. He just steered the old tractor onto the county road, the setting sun warming his back, feeling the vibration of the engine through the soles of his worn work boots. He had work to do. Now, before we get too deep into this story, I have to ask you folks listening, what was the first tractor you ever learned to drive? Was it an old Farmall like Hank's, a 2-cylinder John Deere, an Alice Chalmers, or maybe a Ford A10? Tell me about it down in the comments. I read every single one, and I love hearing about the machines that built this country. The first thing Hank did when he got the M home was park it in his workshop. It wasn't a fancy pole barn like the new ones popping up all over the county. It was an old converted dairy barn with a concrete floor he'd poured himself 20 years ago, and massive, rough-hewn timbers overhead that had been standing since his grandfather's time. The air inside was thick with the smells of his life's work, the sharp tang of penetrating oil, the sweetness of old gasoline, the earthy scent of grease, and the faint, metallic odor of hot steel from the forge in the corner. Tools lined the walls, not thrown in piles, but hung neatly on pegboards, each wrench and socket in its designated, grease-outlined spot. For the next week, the M became his sole focus. This wasn't just about fixing it, it was about knowing it, inside and out. He started by draining all the fluids. The engine oil came out black and thick, the consistency of molasses. He pulled the big canister oil filter, wiping the housing clean before installing a new filter and filling the crankcase with 5 quarts of fresh SAE 30 weight. Next was the transmission and rear end. He pulled the massive plug on the bottom of the cast-iron housing, and a stream of milky, water-contaminated 90-weight gear oil gurgled out. A bad sign, but not a death sentence. It meant a seal was likely leaking somewhere, letting rainwater in. He'd have to keep an eye on it. He moved on to the ignition system. The Farmall M didn't have a modern distributor and coil. It had a magneto, a self-contained unit that generated its own spark. He pulled the IHCH4 magneto off the side of the engine, the impulse coupling giving a sharp clack as it released. On his workbench, under the steady light of a bare bulb, he carefully disassembled it. The points were pitted and burned. He filed them flat with a fine ignition file, checking the gap with a feeler gauge until it was exactly 15/1000ths of an inch, just as the manual specified. He cleaned the rotor, checked the cap for carbon tracks, and gave the whole assembly a shot of lubricant before bolting it back on, making sure to get the timing just right. Then came the carburetor. He pulled the International Harvester unit, broke it down into its component parts in a coffee can full of gasoline. He used a thin piece of wire to clean out the main jet and the idle circuit, blew out all the passages with compressed air from his old Quincy compressor, and put it all back together with a new set of gaskets. He adjusted the idle mixture screw and the main fuel screw to their baseline settings, 1.5 turns out from seated. He'd fine-tune it later, by ear, listening for the smoothest, steadiest rhythm from the exhaust stack. One afternoon, as Hank was torquing the head bolts down after replacing the gasket, he heard the distinctive high-pitched whine of a turbocharger. He looked out the big open barn door and saw Chet Larson's 4430 roaring down the road, pulling a brand-new 20-foot International disc harrow, the kind of implement Hank could only dream of pulling. The Deere's cab was sealed tight, the glass reflecting the afternoon sun. Hank couldn't see Chet, but he could imagine him in there, sitting in his air-cushioned seat, the radio playing, not a speck of dust on him. The Deere passed in a cloud of dust and a wave of noise, leaving the rhythmic pop, pop, pop of Hank's M sounding like a whisper in its wake. Hank just wiped a greasy hand on his rag and went back to his wrench. He knew every bolt on this machine. He wondered if Chet even knew how to change the fuel filter on his. A few days later, Hank was at the co-op in town, picking up a new set of spark plugs and a fan belt. The place was buzzing. The morning coffee crew was in full session, a group of 6 farmers crowded around the counter, Stan Gable from the Deere dealership holding court among them. "And I told him," I said, "Frank, land's not going down. Not with corn at 3.10 a bushel." "He bought that quarter section yesterday for $1,500 an acre," Stan was saying, beaming. "He'll have it paid off in 5 years, mark my words." Chet Larson was there, leaning against a sack of seed corn. "Heck, Stan, I'm looking at that 80 next to my north field. Old man Hemlock wants $2,000 an acre for it. I think I'm gonna do it. You only live once, right? Gotta get big or get out." The other farmers nodded in agreement, their faces a mixture of excitement and anxiety. It was a gold rush, and no one wanted to be left behind. Hank walked up to the counter. "Just these, Dave," he said to the manager, placing the plugs and belt down. Dave nodded, but before he could ring them up, Chet turned. Well, Hank, getting the old girl tuned up for the museum show?" The men chuckled. "Just getting ready for fall plowing, Chet," Hank said evenly. "With that M?" "You'll be plowing till Christmas," Chet shot back. "I'm telling you, man, you're missing the boat. The bank is practically giving money away. You could trade in both those old red tractors and drive off in a brand new 4630. Farm twice the ground in half the time." "I'm happy with the ground I've got," Hank said, taking his change from Dave. "Happy being poor, you mean?" Chet muttered, just loud enough for Hank to hear. Hank paused, his hand on the door. He turned slowly, his calm blue eyes meeting Chet's. "There's a difference between being poor and being broke, Chet. I'm neither. I just don't like owing anybody anything." He walked out, the screen door slamming shut behind him, leaving a sudden, awkward silence in his wake. Driving home in his old Chevy pickup, he felt a knot of anger tighten in his gut. It wasn't just the condescension. It was the feeling of being left behind, of being seen as a relic himself. He knew the numbers. He knew what he was making. It was good money, better than he'd ever made. But he also remembered his father's stories of 1929, of neighbors who had everything, new cars, big farms, fat bank accounts, and then, overnight, had nothing. The bank had owned it all along. The thought sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the automare. The real test came a month later. He was in the middle of planting winter wheat with his old Farmall H and a 10-foot grain drill. It was a race against the weather, with a big rainstorm forecast for the weekend. He was pushing hard, the little H chugging along valiantly, when suddenly the engine sputtered, coughed twice, and died. Silence descended on the field, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant drone of someone else's big, modern tractor. Hank climbed down. He knew the feeling. It wasn't fuel. He'd checked that an hour ago. He pulled a spark plug wire, held it near the block, and cranked the engine. No spark. The magneto. He'd rebuilt the one on the M, but he hadn't touched the one on the H in years. A rookie mistake. He swore under his breath. He didn't have a phone in his pocket to call for help. There was no dealer service truck to summon. There was only him. He looked at the 2 miles of field between him and the workshop. Resigned, he started walking. An hour later, dusty and sweating, he was back at the field in his pickup, carrying a spare magneto he'd bought for parts years ago, and a toolbox. He worked under the fading light, his knuckles getting scraped on the hot engine block. He had to pull the valve cover to find top dead center on the number 1 cylinder's compression stroke, then carefully mesh the magneto's drive lugs to get the timing right. It was tedious, greasy work. As he was tightening the last bolt, a set of headlights swept across his field. It was Chet, heading home in his pickup. He slowed down, rolled down his window. "Having trouble, Hank?" he called out, a smug grin on his face. "Just a little magneto trouble." "I've got it," Hank grunted, not looking up. "You know," Chet said, leaning his arm on the windowsill, "the Deere dealership has a service truck on call 24/7. "I'm my own service truck," Hank replied, giving the magneto one last check. Chet just laughed, a short, sharp sound that grated on Hank's nerves. "Suit yourself. Have fun playing with your antiques." He rolled up his window and sped off, leaving Hank alone in the twilight with his broken-down machine. Hank finally got it started 10 minutes later, the engine sputtering back to life. But he'd lost 3 precious hours. The storm was rolling in, and he knew he wouldn't finish in time. That night, the rain came, and 10 acres of his wheat field would have to wait until spring. It was a small loss, but it felt like a big defeat. The next few years were a strange time. The mid-1970s roared on, and the profits of agricultural expansion looked like geniuses. The price of corn and soybeans stayed high, fueled by massive overseas demand. Land that Hank's father had bought for $200 an acre was now selling for $2,000, and then $2,500. The government was practically begging farmers to produce more, guaranteeing loans and pushing for fence-row-to-fence-row planting. It felt like the good times would never end. Chet Larson became the local legend, the embodiment of the new farming philosophy. He bought that 80 acres from Old Man Hemlock, financing the whole purchase. Then he bought another 160 acres when the farm next to it went up for auction, outbidding everyone with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. To work all that new ground, his 4430 and 4630, weren't enough. Hank saw the lowboy truck from the John Deere dealership pull into Chet's driveway one spring morning. When it left, a brand new John Deere 8630 articulated 4-wheel drive tractor sat gleaming in the yard. It was a monster, a beast of a machine that cost more than Hank's entire farm was worth. Chet didn't stop there. A new, bigger machine shed went up, followed by 3 massive blue harvester silos that towered over the landscape. He traded combines, going from a 6600 to a 7700, and then to the new 8820, the biggest, most advanced machine John Deere had ever built. His wife drove a new Lincoln Continental, and they took a vacation to Hawaii every winter. At the co-op, farmers spoke his name with a kind of reverence. He was smart, he was aggressive, and he was winning. Meanwhile, Hank Miller just kept doing what he'd always done. His 2 Farmalls, the H and the M, were the heart of his operation. He ploughed with the M, pulling a 4-bottom plough, turning the black soil over in neat, straight furrows. He planted and cultivated with the H. They were slow, they were loud, and they had no creature comforts. But they always started, and they were cheap to run. He was making good money, the best of his life. The high crop prices benefited him, just like everyone else. But what he did with that money was different. While Chet was signing loan papers, Hank was making the final payment on the farm's original mortgage, a debt his father had taken on 30 years prior. He walked out of the bank that day, feeling 10 pounds lighter, holding a piece of paper that said the 240 acres his grandfather had homesteaded were truly, finally, 100% his. Instead of buying more land, he invested in his own. He tiled a low-lying 40 that had always been too wet, dramatically improving its yield. He replaced the leaky roof on the big dairy barn and put up a new fence around the pasture. He bought a dozen more head of Hereford cattle, a walking savings account that paid dividends in calves every spring. The extra money went into the bank, into simple savings accounts and government bonds. The community's perception of him shifted. He was no longer just seen as old-fashioned. He was now considered a fool, a man with no vision, no ambition. He was letting the opportunity of a lifetime, the chance to get rich, to build an empire, slip through his fingers. The whispers at the diner were constant. Can you believe Hank Miller's still running those old tractors? He could have bought the Hemlock place for a song 2 years ago, and now look at it. He's scared. His old man went through the 30s and filled his head with all that doom and gloom. Chet, now a pillar of the farming community, even made a public show of trying to help him. He cornered Hank after church one Sunday. "Hank, listen," Chet said, putting on his most sincere face. "I'm expanding again, and I'm going to need a man to run my second combine this fall. It's good money, and frankly, I'm worried about you. You can't keep going on like this. Let me buy your place. I'll give you a fair price, more than it's worth with that old equipment on it. You can stay in the house as long as you want. It's time to retire. Enjoy life." The offer was so condescending, so wrapped in false pity, that it took all of Hank's self-control not to react. He just looked at Chet's expensive suit and his perfectly polished shoes. "My farm's not for sale, Chet, and I'm not looking for a job, but I appreciate you thinking of me." He walked away, leaving Chet shaking his head, as if dealing with a stubborn child. Even Hank's wife, Martha, felt the pressure. She never said a word against his decisions, but he saw how she looked at the new cars and remodeled kitchens of the other farm wives. He knew she heard the talk in town. One night, she quietly asked, "Are we going to be okay, Hank? Everyone else is getting so far ahead." Hank took her hand. "We're okay because we don't owe anyone," he said. "We have money in the bank. The land is ours. The tractors are ours. No matter what happens with the price of corn, nobody can take this away from us. That's a different kind of ahead." She squeezed his hand and nodded, but he could still see the worry in her eyes. The decade was drawing to a close, It was a cool evening in the late fall of 1979. Hank sat in his worn armchair, listening to the farm report on the radio. The harvest was in. Another good one. The bins were full. Prices were still strong, but the announcer's tone was different tonight. He wasn't talking about grain exports or land values. He was talking about inflation, about the price of fuel and fertilizer doubling in a year. He was talking about a new man in Washington, the head of the Federal Reserve, a man named Paul Volcker. And in a dramatic move to combat runaway inflation, the announcer's voice crackled. Chairman Volcker has announced the Federal Reserve will begin aggressively tightening the money supply, leading to what analysts predict will be a sharp and sustained rise in interest rates. Hank leaned forward, turning the volume up. Prime interest rate, variable rate loans, economic slowdown. The words hung in the air of the quiet farmhouse. He got up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out into the darkness. A single light burned on his workshop pole, illuminating his two old Farmalls, sitting side by side, their faded red paint looking almost regal in the soft glow. They were paid for. They were his. He then looked east, across the fields, toward Chet Larson's place. The whole farmstead was lit up like a small city. Giant mercury vapor lights on the new machine should cast long, sharp shadows from the massive, gleaming machines parked inside. The John Deere 8630, the 8820 combine, the fleet of brand-new tractors and plows, an empire of green and yellow iron, an empire built on promises and paper, an empire that Hank suddenly realized with a cold, sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach belonged entirely to the bank. The radio announcer kept talking, but Hank no longer heard the words. He only heard the distant rumble of an approaching storm, a storm that had nothing to do with the weather. The winter of 1980 came in hard and stayed late, a bitter, bone-deep cold that seemed to freeze the very optimism in the air. The news about the grain embargo against the Soviet Union hit the coffee shops and co-ops like a physical blow. The biggest customer for American corn was gone, just like that. The price, which had flirted with $4 a bushel, faltered, then began a long, sickening slide. At first, the experts on the radio said it was temporary, a blip, but the slide didn't stop. By spring, the prime interest rate, which had been a manageable 7 or 8% when Chet Larson signed the papers for his last 160 acres and his 8630, had climbed to 15%, then 18%. Then it crested an unbelievable 21%. The variable rate loans that had fueled the boom years suddenly became anchors, pulling farmers under. The phone started ringing at the Larson house, and the calls weren't from neighbors. They were from the bank. Hank felt the squeeze, too. The price of diesel fuel nearly doubled. A bag of seed corn that cost $40 last year was now $65. But his costs were manageable. He bought his fuel in cash. He paid for his seed from his savings. The biggest line item on his balance sheet, the mortgage payment, wasn't there. He and Martha lived simply, their needs met by the cream check from their small dairy herd and the money from the cattle they sold. The grain was profit, and while that profit was shrinking, it was still there. One sweltering afternoon in July, Hank was cultivating his corn with the Farmall H, the old tractor chugging along reliably. He was on the fence row bordering Chet's land and saw a sight that made him stop. Chet's massive John Deere 8630, the articulated giant, was sitting dead in the middle of the field, its huge dual wheels sunk into a wet spot. A plume of white smoke, or maybe steam, curled from under its long green hood. 100 yards away, Chet was pacing back and forth, his hands on his hips, kicking at the dirt. Hank shut down the H and walked over. "Trouble, Chet?" he asked, his voice neutral. Chet spun around, his face slick with sweat and streaked with grease. His usual cocky grin was gone, replaced by a mask of pure frustration. Trouble? The turbo went out, spitting oil all over the manifold. You know what a new turbo for this thing costs? $3,000. $3,000. And the dealer can't get one for a week. A week? I've got 200 acres of beans to spray before this next rain comes. Hank nodded, looking at the complex maze of hoses, wires, and plumbing under the Deere's hood. It looked more like the inside of a spaceship than a tractor. That's a tough break. Tough break? Chet laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. This is the third time this year this thing has left me stranded. Last spring, it was an electronic control module for the transmission, $2,000. The time before that, a hydraulic pump, $2,500. This thing costs more to fix than your whole farm is worth. He kicked one of the giant tires, the rubber barely budging. Stan Gable told me this was the future. This is progress. Looks more like a 300 horsepower paperweight to me. Hank didn't say anything. He just looked at the silent green monster, then back at his own little Farmall H, patiently idling at the end of the row, its simple engine waiting. There was a nothing on that H that he couldn't fix himself with a set of wrenches and parts he could buy at any auto supply store. Chet's anger suddenly deflated, replaced by a weary exhaustion. "I don't know what I'm going to do, Hank," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The bank, they're calling every day. The payment on this thing is more than my house payment. The payments on the land, they adjusted the interest. It's impossible." For the first time, Hank saw past the arrogant young farmer and saw a man, terrified and trapped. "You'll figure something out," Hank said, though the words felt hollow even to him. Chet just shook his head and stared out at his fields, at the empire he had built. "I already sold off half my cattle to make the spring payment," he admitted. "There's nothing left to sell, except the iron. And who's buying tractors right now?" The cracks were showing, not just in Chet's finances, but in the man himself. The foundation of his world, built on the promise of ever higher prices and ever bigger machines, was crumbling beneath his feet. Hank walked back to his own tractor, climbed onto the familiar steel seat, and pulled the throttle lever down. The H responded with a steady, reassuring roar. He eased the clutch out and continued his work, the simple, rhythmic process of farming a small piece of ground that was truly his own, a stark contrast to the silent, complicated failure sitting in the field next door. The next 2 years were a slow, grinding descent into a nightmare for Miller County. The economic storm Hank had sensed on the horizon had made landfall, and it was a Category 5. The headlines in the local paper went from optimistic reports of record yields to grim announcements of farm foreclosures. The auction notices, once a sign of retirement or upgrading, became weekly lists of financial ruin. Friends and neighbors Hank had known his whole life, good farmers who worked hard, were losing everything. They had followed the advice of the bankers and the dealers, leveraged their family homesteads to expand, and were now being crushed by the same system that had encouraged them. The coffee shop talk changed. There was no more boasting about new equipment or land purchases. The conversations were hushed, fearful. Men spoke of loan officers who had once been friendly partners and were now cold-eyed adversaries. They talked about the impossible math of $2 corn and 20% interest. They talked about the auction down the road, the one last week and the one scheduled for next Saturday. A cloud of depression and despair settled over the countryside, as thick and suffocating as the dust from a summer drought. Stan Gable's John Deere dealership, once the gleaming temple of modern agriculture, began to look like a graveyard. The lot, which used to be packed with new and used equipment, was now half empty. The few machines left were trade-ins that farmers could no longer make payments on. Stan himself was a changed man. The easy smile was gone, replaced by a permanent, worried frown. He stopped holding court at the co-op. One day, a sign appeared in the window. Closed. The bank had called his loans, too. The apostle of debt had become its victim. Hank and Martha watched it all with a sense of quiet dread. They were surviving. Their savings, which had seemed so foolishly conservative during the boom, were now their lifeline. They paid their property taxes, bought their groceries, and kept the lights on. Hank's workshop became a sanctuary. He kept his old machines running with skill and ingenuity, fabricating parts he could no longer buy, nursing the tired iron through another season. He felt a deep, sorrowful guilt for his own stability when so many around him were sinking. Then came the day he had known was coming. A large, stark notice was posted at the courthouse and printed in the paper. An absolute auction. By order of the Miller County Savings and Loan. The property of Chet and Linda Larson, all real estate, including 640 acres, house and outbuildings, all farm machinery, livestock, and personal property. The day of the auction was cold and grey, a November sky threatening snow. The crowd was huge, but the mood was funereal. It wasn't like the auction where Hank had bought his M. There was no excitement, no friendly bidding wars. Farmers stood in tight, silent groups, their faces grim. They were there not to celebrate a neighbor's retirement, but to witness his financial execution and perhaps to pick over the bones for a bargain. They were also there because they knew, deep down, that it could just as easily be them. Chet's magnificent fleet of green and yellow machinery was lined up in the yard, looking forlorn and out of place. The 80-60-30, the 8820 Combine, the row of 40 series tractors, they were monuments to a dream that had died. Hank saw Chet standing by the porch of his house, a house his grandfather had built. He was a ghost of the man he had been. His shoulders were slumped, his face was pale and drawn, and he stared into the distance, his eyes vacant. Linda, his wife, stood beside him, her arms wrapped around herself as if to ward off the cold, but Hank knew it was a chill that came from within. The auctioneer started with the small items from the workshop, wrenches sold for pennies on the dollar, air compressors, welders, tools that had taken a lifetime to accumulate, were gone in minutes. Then he moved to the tractors. The big 8630, which had cost Chet over $100,000 just a few years before, was the main event. The bidding was slow, hesitant. No one had that kind of money anymore, and no one wanted to take on that kind of debt. It finally sold for $20,000 to an out-of-state salvage dealer who would likely part it out and sell the pieces. Hank didn't bid on any of the big equipment. He had no need for it, and no desire to profit from his neighbor's misery. But he watched as the auctioneer moved to the parcels of land. The new ground Chet had bought, the land he'd paid $2,000 and $3,000 an acre for, sold for $600. The bank bought most of it back, adding it to its growing inventory of foreclosed farms. Finally, the auctioneer came to the last parcel. All right, folks, this is the home quarter. 160 acres with the house, the barn, the original homestead. A beautiful piece of ground. Been in the Larson family for 3 generations. A hush fell over the crowd. This was the heart of it all. This was the family legacy, the place where Chet had grown up. The bidding started low. Hank saw Chet flinch with every bid, as if each call of the auctioneer was a physical blow. The price crept up to $700 an acre. The bidding stalled. "Going once," the auctioneer called. "Going twice." Hank felt a nudge at his elbow. It was Martha. Her eyes were fixed on Linda Larson, who was now openly weeping. "Do something, Hank," she whispered. Hank looked at the land, at the house, at the broken man on the porch. He thought of his own father, of the stories of the Depression, of the deep, abiding belief that a man's worth was tied to the land he worked. He raised his hand. 7:25. Hank's voice rang out, clear and steady in the cold air. A murmur went through the crowd. All eyes turned to him. The auctioneer's gaze found him. "I've got $725 an acre from Hank Miller. Do I hear 750? Silence. The bank's representative shook his head. They had already acquired enough land for one day. 725 once, twice, sold, to Hank Miller. The gavel fell with a crack that sounded like a rifle shot. A collective sigh went through the crowd. Hank walked toward the clerk's trailer, his face unreadable. He felt no triumph, only a heavy sense of responsibility. He had just spent nearly all of his life savings. He saw Chet look at him, a flicker of disbelief, of confusion, of something that might have been gratitude in his hollow eyes, before he turned and walked into the house, closing the door behind him. The weeks that followed the auction were somber. The Larson farm sat empty, a silent testament to the brutal efficiency of the crisis. The community treated Hank with a new kind of respect, tinged with awe. He hadn't just survived. He had reached out a hand when another man was drowning. It was an act of quiet defiance against the cold calculus of the banks. A few days before Christmas, Hank drove his old Chevy pickup down the lane to the Larson place. He found Chet in the machine shed, packing the last of his personal belongings into cardboard boxes. The cavernous building, once filled with giant machines, was eerily empty. "Chet," Hank said, his voice echoing in the space. Chet looked up. He looked older, thinner, but some of the haunted look was gone from his eyes. "Hank, I don't know what to say. Thank you for what you did." "It's good ground," Hank said simply. "Hated to see it go to the bank." He paused, then held out a set of keys. "I came to ask you something. I own this land now, but I can't farm it. Not by myself. I've got my own 240 to worry about. I was wondering if you'd be interested in renting it. On shares. You live in the house, you work the ground, we split the profit, whatever there is." Chet stared at the keys, then at Hank, his mouth agape. "Rent it? From you?" "Hank, I can't. I have nothing. The bank took everything. I don't have a tractor, a plow, nothing." "You've got more than that," Hank said. "You know this land better than anyone. As for the equipment..." He nodded his head toward the open shed door. Parked just outside was Hank's Farmall M, hitched to the four-bottom plow. Behind it sat the H, hooked to the planter. "They're not new, they're not fast, but they're paid for, and they run. You can use them until you get back on your feet." Tears welled up in Chet's eyes. He looked at the old red tractors, the kind of machines he had once openly mocked, and saw them for what they were. A lifeline. He slowly reached out and took the keys from Hank's hand, his own trembling slightly. "Why?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "After everything I said, all the times I made fun of you." Hank looked out across the frozen fields, the black dirt resting under a light dusting of snow. "Because we're neighbors," he said, "and because my father always told me that the only thing that gets you through the hard times is helping each other. The banks won't. The government might try. But in the end, it's just us." The years that followed were lean, but they were not hopeless. Working side by side, Hank and Chet farmed both places. Chet, humbled and stripped of his ambition for empire, rediscovered a love for the simple act of farming. He learned the quirks of the old Farmalls, the art of listening to the engine to set the carburetor just right, the skill of fixing a magneto with a feeler gauge and a small file. He learned the deep satisfaction of ending a season with no new debt, of owning the seed for next year's crop outright. The community began to heal. Other farmers, inspired by Hank's example, started banding together, sharing equipment, helping neighbors through harvests, creating a network of support that had been forgotten during the heady days of the boom. The wisdom of the old ways, once dismissed as outdated, was now sought after. Men would stop by Hank's workshop not to talk about interest rates, but to ask how to overhaul an engine or where to find a part for a 30-year-old combine. By the late 1980s, the crisis had passed, commodity prices stabilized, and land values slowly began to recover. One fall afternoon, Chet came over to Hank's house and sat down at the kitchen table. He pushed a cashier's check across the table to Hank. It was for the full amount Hank had paid for the Larson homestead, plus a modest amount of interest. "I'm buying my farm back, Hank," Chet said, a quiet pride in his voice. "The bank finally agreed to give me a loan. A sensible one this time." Hank looked at the check, then at the man across from him. This was not the brash, arrogant Chet of the 1970s. This was a man who had been through the fire and emerged stronger, wiser. "I never had any doubt you would," Hank said, sliding the check back across the table. "You don't owe me any interest. Just pay me what I paid for it. That was the deal I made with myself that day." Life settled into a new rhythm. Hank grew older, his hands more gnarled, his steps a little slower, but his eyes were as clear as ever. He never expanded, never bought a new tractor with a cab or a radio. He didn't need to. His wealth wasn't measured in acres or horsepower, but in the peace of mind that came from owning his life's work, free and clear. One warm spring evening, years later, Hank stood by the fence row, watching his grandson, a boy of 16, ploughing a field with the old Farmall M. The boy sat perched on the same steel seat Hank had sat on for decades, his brow furrowed in concentration as he learned to keep the furrow straight. The engine's deep, rhythmic pop, pop, pop was the same sound Hank had heard on the day he drove it home from the auction. It was the sound of independence. The boy saw his grandfather and waved. Hank waved back, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across his face. He had his land, he had his family, he had his farm, and it was all his. He had learned the lesson his own father had taught him, a lesson forged in the hardship of the Great Depression and proven true in the crucible of the farm crisis, that the heaviest chains are not made of iron, but of paper and promises, and that true freedom is not the power to buy anything you want, but the peace of knowing you don't owe anything to anyone. The sun was setting, casting a golden light across the freshly turned earth, and the old red tractor, a relic from another time, looked like the most valuable machine in the world.